involved. Move back. Get away. Somebody stay with me. Everybody else.
It's left a city in shock, but for Jews across the country, their sense of safety has been shattered.
It is a hatred that is rising once again, and Britain must defeat it once again.
After Thursday's anti-Semitic terror attack in Manchester claimed 2 innocent lives, it's also raised questions about what it's like to be a Jew in 2025.
Looked evil in the face. We can't allow evil to win. And that goes to the granular level of every single one of us. We all need to be better.
So how will the country respond? I'm Nina Hossain, and this is What You Need to Know. Joining me is our UK editor, Paul Brand, who has been reporting from Manchester. Paul, what have we learned so far about the attacker?
We know Jihad al-Shami was 35 years old, that he lived in Prestwich, which is about 2 miles away from the synagogue that he attacked. And we also know he was a British citizen of Syrian descent. So we know he came to the UK as a child. He was granted citizenship at the age of 16. And his father was a trauma surgeon who had worked in war zones around the world. Police described al-Shami as having Islamist ideology, or potentially being inspired by Islamist ideology, extreme Islamist ideology. And certainly the picture that we're learning from those who knew him is of a man who didn't really speak to his neighbours, kept himself to himself. We've heard from one ex-partner of his that he was a pretty coercive and controlling person in her view. And he is not known to counter-terrorism policing up until this time. But he did have a relationship with the police because he was on bail, having been arrested on suspicion of rape.
Paul, from being at the scene and speaking to members of the community in Manchester, how would you describe the impact of this attack so far?
I mean, the grief obviously is apparent when you speak to people, particularly in Manchester, in that community around the synagogue. I think the feeling that really surprised me was the sheer level of anger, and that sense that people felt that this was to be expected, that they had feared an attack like this. There's been this extraordinary rise in anti-Semitism over the past 2 years. I think that has been forgotten about to some extent. It was reported on at the outset of the October the 7th atrocities and in the weeks and months following that. But really, it hasn't had a lot of attention, either from the media and certainly in the view of many people in the Jewish community, from the government either. They feel as though the government hasn't taken it seriously enough, not necessarily because the government doesn't care, but just because they haven't made it a priority. And we've seen in more recent weeks the government recognizing the state of Palestine, for example. Of course, the issue of Jewish life here and Jewish life in Israel and the state of Israel are 2 completely separate things. But many in the Jewish community here feel as though the government hadn't anticipated the impact on them that recognizing the state of Palestine would have, that allowing the pro-Palestinian protests to go ahead would have. Obviously, the policing of protest has been a very controversial element of the past 2 years as well. No easy right or wrong answer about any of that. But yeah, it's that sense of anger, I think. And that came out, didn't it? We saw the Deputy Prime Minister, David Lammy, visited Manchester last week, and he was heckled by a very, very upset crowd of Jewish people. He'd come to address them, to try and reassure them. I think, if anything, though, what he really got from that crowd was the sense of their frustration at the government's approach to all of these things.
Shame on you!
That response honours those we have lost.
You're embarrassing!
May their memory be a blessing.
And he did say afterwards, actually, that he understood some of that frustration. But I think the government perhaps has been surprised by just the strength of feeling that there is among the Jewish community.
You talked about the rise in anti-Semitism. How much has it grown over the years? What's the evidence?
Well, there is indisputable evidence that anti-Semitism has risen significantly over the past couple of years. There are several different ways of measuring the rise in anti-Semitism. All of those measures point to an increase in hate crime towards Jewish people. One of the latest sets of data comes from the Community Security Trust. They've been monitoring anti-Semitism for the past 30 years or so, and they recorded 1,521 cases of anti-Semitic hate incidents just in the first half of this year. That's the second highest level they've ever recorded. And if you speak to Jewish people, certainly polling suggests, again, that the perception of the way they're being treated also points to a rise in anti-Semitism. Something like 35% of Jewish people in Britain now no longer feel safe here. About half of them say that they feel as though there's been this rise in anti-Semitism, or that they've personally experienced it. And I think, as I say, because there's been a huge emphasis, totally understandably, on the humanitarian plight in Gaza over the past few months, and there's been a huge outpouring of sympathy and concern and outrage and horror at what's happening to Gazan citizens, that has taken up a huge amount of focus in the media. Again, there's no issue with that. Of course it should have a huge amount of focus. But there are Jewish people who feel as though the hatred that they are suffering in the United Kingdom has not really been recognised, while emotions have been running incredibly high about the situation in Gaza.
We have seen the higher police presence outside synagogues since the attack. Are you getting any sense, any sign that is helping to reassure Jewish communities right now?
I think it offers a certain level of reassurance, but again, there's that sense of anger that Jewish people feel they've had to actually provide their own security predominantly. It's something that they're used to doing. It's a tradition that they've long had, actually, of providing their own security. I've travelled around Stamford Hill in North London with a Shomrim recently. That's essentially the Jewish community's own neighbourhood policing force, where they literally go out in cars that look like police cars, and they attend incidents very quickly in order to reassure their own community. I think there is frustration that they feel as though they've had to take on that responsibility themselves, that the policing operation hasn't necessarily been there to back them up at all times. But certainly the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister have been very clear the past few days that this heightened police response will be available to the Jewish community for as long as is necessary.
And Paul, you mentioned the protests in support of Palestine Action that have gone ahead since the attack, despite calls from both the Home Secretary and Prime Minister for them not to go ahead. What action is the government now considering?
Yeah, so these protests took place regardless of what the government said. Over the weekend, around 500 people actually were arrested at one protest in support of that prescribed group, Palestine Action. The Home Secretary announced that she wants to increase the police powers to disrupt protest, essentially, to move protests on, to change their location, particularly this issue of repeat protests. So she feels as though in certain sensitive areas, certain sensitive communities, the Jewish population have suffered from the fact that there have been these repeat protests around the situation in Gaza pretty much weekly. And so she wants the police to have the ability, where those are causing community tensions, to move the protest on, to maybe change the time of the protest, to change the location of the protest. She's also calling on the police, though, to use the powers that they already have. She believes they have significant powers already in order to make sure these protests are peaceful, are respectful, do not target any particular community. But certainly, again, when you speak to the Jewish community, you do get that sense that they feel as though the protests have been inflammatory. I've got to say, this is one of the most sensitive and difficult things I've ever reported on in my career, because things are so polarized and so passionate and so there's so much hurt on both sides of this debate that I've got to say there are those who come out and protest in favour of Palestine who feel that is incredibly important to do, and that they've been restricted too much, actually, in the way that they protest. Of course, there are those who believe that Palestine Action shouldn't have been prescribed, though the government insists that it is a terrorist organisation. So this is a really tricky area. And for the government, I think they find themselves in a bind, really, because they are being criticised from many different angles about the response to all of this.
Yeah, absolutely complex times, no doubt. That is all we've got time for this time. Paul, thank you. For all the latest, head to itv.com/news and follow ITV on YouTube. Until our next briefing, thank you for joining us.